In the second half of the 1960s, the Soviet Navy was in the process of commissioning two separate classes of aircraft carrying cruisers. Moskva and Leningrad arrived in the Black Sea from 1967, at which point design of the much larger Kiev class was well underway. The first of these would enter service in 1975. Although the Soviet Navy had well-proven rotary wing designs, they lacked a fixed-wing aircraft that could operate from these ships in support of amphibious landings or to extend the perimeter of a task force's air defense umbrella. But even the Kievs lacked catapults and arresting gear. Another solution was required. The operational need was timely for the Yakovlev OKB. From 1960 they had developed and then flown the Yak-36, known to the West as the Freehand. Yak-36 was a true vertical takeoff and landing jet fighter, able to successfully operate from the same footprint as a large helicopter. Unfortunately, it was quite a limited aircraft that had the performance and ordnance carrying capabilities of a MiG-15, but 15 years too late to be useful. It was, however, validation of the principles of VTOL jet flight, and Yakovlev were convinced that it could be developed into a successful supersonic fighter if more funds were forthcoming. The Soviet Air Force had no interest, and the project was on the verge of being mothballed when the Navy's requirement emerged. Alexander Yakovlev was a friend of Armaments Minister Dmitry Ustinov from their wartime service, and the two men were able to convince Admiral Gorshkov, the CNC of the Navy, that an advanced version of the Yak-36 was the aircraft that he needed. On the 28th of December 1967, the Central Committee set out a specification for a vertical takeoff and landing Yak-36M with a maximum speed of 755 knots at high altitude and 750 nautical miles of range while carrying a 2,200-pound bomb load in a high-low-high attack profile. This was vastly better performance than the Freehand offered. It could barely tickle 550 knots in a dive. Yakovlev was not about to say that, though. The aircraft was to be able to operate from the carrier deck and from semi-prepared strips ashore. The latter would be necessary to support the amphibious operations for which the Navy was preparing. Ideally, though, the Yak-36M would be able to defend the fleet using advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles. That potential employment meant that it would need to carry sophisticated radar, fire control, navigational, and communications equipment. The technical challenge was such that it was quickly decided to split the program into two phases. The first would deliver a reduced capability aircraft that could carry short-ranged infrared homing missiles, dumb air-to-ground munitions, and guided anti-ship missiles. The advanced Yak-36P version would follow at a later date. Weapons load for the austere aircraft would be based around the K-13 ATOL and the R-60 AFID missiles in the air defense role. That would be enough to deal with slow-flying NATO patrol aircraft. For anti-ship sorties, a pair of Kh-23M Grom missiles could be carried along with their Delta-NG guidance pod. Grom, or AS-7 Kerry to NATO, was a command-guided missile analogous to the AGM-12 Bullpup, right down to the 250-pound warhead. The Grom had only a maximum of 6 miles of range, and realistically the small warhead was only useful against fast attack ships that lacked defensive SAM systems. One 23mm cannon was intended to be fitted in each wing root, with up to 180 rounds of ammunition each. A single RN-28 tactical nuclear weapon of up to 30 kiloton yield could also be carried on the inner wing pylon or a variety of bombs and rockets. Bomb aiming was via the same PBK-3 sight developed for the Sukhoi 7. The radar gun sight was a new ASP-17 unit. Podded Siren or Geran jammers could be carried in pods if required for self-defense, but there was no internal chaff and flare dispenser. Once the specifications were out of the way, the difficult job of updating the Yak-36 began in earnest. Most challenging was the lack of a suitable power plant. Yakovlev himself wanted Soviet industry to develop an equivalent dual-flow turbofan to the Bristol Pegasus that powered Hawker's P-1127. That wasn't going to happen, so he was forced to take a different tack. The Yak-36 had two R-27 engines, and Tamansky had developed their design to give over 14,500 pounds of force per motor. The issue with this was that the engines were gas guzzlers, and although they'd give speed, acceleration, and lifting power, they would also mean the aircraft lacked useful range. This had been the main issue with the Yak-36. The Yak design team therefore concluded that the best option was to combine one R-27 V300 engine, fed via intakes on the fuselage sides, with a pair of small, lightweight lifting engines. These vertically mounted RD-36s each gave 5,160 pounds of force as originally supplied, but they were soon developed to give 6,384 pounds each. Because the Yak-36P would be heavier, this aircraft would have three of the updated R-36s. The lift engines were mounted directly aft of the cockpit and breathed through a pop-up panel in the upper fuselage. The main engine had rotating nozzles that could direct thrust down at the rear of the aircraft, thus providing balanced lifting force. This arrangement had the weakness that thrust was not evenly distributed around the centre of gravity, meaning that the Yak-36M could not perform the same kind of in-flight thrust vectoring as the contemporary Harrier. Bleed air from the main engines was used to start the lift jets. Air for the reaction control jets on the wingtips was supplied by the main engine. When installed, the combination gave 25,898 pounds of force. Designed empty weight of the Yak-36M was 14,363 pounds. Loaded with 2,200 pounds of weapons, a full load of fuel and sundries gave a normal takeoff weight of 22,050 pounds, and a marginal thrust-to-mass ratio of 1.175 to 1. A rolling takeoff might improve matters somewhat, but the Yak-37M wasn't really designed for that, nor were the carriers. Developing rolling takeoff and roll-on landing techniques took some time. Another feature of the design was the need for great engine reliability, something that was a struggle for Soviet designers in this period. Even a minor failure with either the main engine or the lift jets would immediately throw the aircraft out of trim and lead to a crash. Because the lift jets were only typically operating at low altitude and reaction time would be limited, an auto-ejection system was included that would get the pilot out as soon as the nose went up above 15 degrees, down 10 degrees, or a 30-degree bank angle was reached. Those are numbers for hovering flight. Ejection was pilot-initiated when the lift jets weren't operating, or it was supposed to be at least. Ejection was through the canopy in hovering flight. It would be explosively jettisoned in normal flight as there was expected to be more time. Whereas the Freehand had been a dumpy aircraft, its successor was a narrow, taut-looking plane. The fuselage was 51.4 feet long and it was made of supposedly corrosion-resistant aluminium alloy. Wings were crop deltas again, this time with a 10-degree anhedral. Leading edge sweep increased from about 37 degrees on the Yak-36 to 45 degrees on the 36M. Wingspan was just 24 feet, and they could fold to reduce that width to just 14 feet 5 inches for shipboard stowage. Control surfaces were hydraulically boosted, as you'd expect, and there was redundancy in the system. The wings were too thin for tanks, so all the fuel was in two fuselage tanks, which held a total of 6,063 pounds, or 900 gallons if you prefer. There was space for two pylons per wing, and the inboard pylons were plumbed for fuel tanks. The wingtips had the reaction control nozzles firing up and down. There was also another reaction control nozzle under the tail at the back, as there was in the Yak-36. The tail nozzle could swivel rather than simply being fixed for additional control. Reaction control was all controlled by an updated version of the Freehand's automated flight control system. Remember that control system was hydromechanical with an analog computer at the center. There was no fly-by-wire to control the combination of puffer jets at the extremities and the four lift thrusters. It was thus a remarkable achievement. Landing gear at least was more conventional than the previous Freehand, which had a bicycle setup with wingtip outriggers. Yak-36M had a more conventional tricycle setup which retracted into the fuselage. During the process of detailed design, some elements of the weapons and avionics suite were altered. Most notably, the fixed cannon was replaced by a GSH-23L that could be carried in a VSPU-36 pod under the fuselage. The gun sight was downgraded to the PBK-2 from the early Sukhoi 7, and the gun sight was now the ASP PF-7M, also from the fitter. Finally, the contents of the Delta NG guidance pod for the Grom missiles was mounted internally. 4 prototypes were constructed from this initial design, but before any free flights could be attempted, a series of static tests were undertaken, including 1,000 in-flight engine starts with a fuselage suspended underneath a Tu-16 Badger. When it was time to attempt some hovering trials, the same issues that had been encountered on the Freehand reared their heads. Jet blast reflected off the ground, swirled above the wings, and exerted a downwards pressure that kept the aircraft down. Fitting strakes under the fuselage channeled this air and solved the problem, but it's a bit odd that these weren't fitted prior to the testing beginning in September 1971. The first transition from hovering to forward flight took place in March 1972. Flight testing was generally quite uneventful. Extensive experience with the Freehand had apparently found its way into other aspects of the design, and they led to an effective, if complicated, setup. Based on the success of the land-based trials, the Yak-36M went to sea for the first time in November 1972, making its first successful deck landing on the Moskva on the 18th of that month. Full sea trials began in January 1973. The final prototype incorporated numerous changes based on testing of the previous 3 prototypes. The track was widened to increase stability during the inevitable rebounds off the carrier deck. Splitter plates were fitted to separate the now widened air intakes from the fuselage. The cockpit was raised and the nose was redesigned to improve visibility during approach. Some avionics also changed. In particular, the Delta NG system was removed from the fuselage and replaced with an internal Sirene active jamming system, which was judged to be more useful more of the time. As the Yak-36M neared production, a Sirena radar warning receiver was added and the gun sight was changed again, this time to the simpler ASP-21 system from the MiG-21. The Yak-36M was now a functioning combat aircraft that could take off and land vertically while carrying at least a moderately useful combat load. What it was not was fast or high performance in any real sense. Although wingspan had stayed at 23 feet, the fuselage had grown to 53 feet 8 inches, and empty weight to 14,451 pounds empty. Maximum takeoff was 22,707 pounds for a vertical lift, or later 24,912 on a rolling takeoff. That meant that it could lift 1,500 pounds of weapons as a jump jet, or 3,500 pounds when rolling. Rolling takeoffs were accomplished by running the engines up to full power with the vectored thrust nozzle set to 60 degrees. They were quickly rotated up to 25 degrees using the thumb switch on the control stick as the aircraft gained speed across the deck. Run-on landings were also possible, although aircraft required dorsal strakes to be added to prevent compressor stalls during the low-speed approach. It was essentially limited to a pair of ATOLs or aphids and internal fuel when taking off vertically. Maximum speed was 713 miles an hour at sea level and 630 at 30,000 feet. It was barely transonic. Combat radius was just over 200 miles when loaded for interception or for a strike using a pair of Groms. The Soviet Navy was completely aware of the limitations of the Yak-36M, but they were also practical. The Soviet Union had never operated a fixed-wing aircraft from a ship. They needed to learn tactics, deck handling, and so on. Deploying a vertical takeoff fighter, however limited, would also provide practical lessons that would allow the next generation of aircraft to be more effective. So they persevered. Production began at Saratov in either late 1973 or early 1974, with the first production standard aircraft delivered at the end of September 1974. The type's first crash came in April 1975 when a lift engine failed during a ferry flight from the factory. The aircraft immediately went nose down, but the auto-ejection system failed to function and the pilot was badly injured in the resulting crash. The exact opposite happened in March 1976. A pilot took off vertically in his Yak-36M, transitioned to horizontal flight at the usual height of about 65 feet. As he climbed through 440 feet and accelerated past 220 knots, the auto-ejection system took it upon itself to shoot him out of the aircraft. But after the pilot had parachuted down onto the frozen Volga, the Forger continued to fly for some time. After 18 minutes, in which it had carved a wide circle initially towards Moscow and then back to Saratov, the aircraft stalled and spun to the ground with its main engine still operating. On landing, the remaining fuel caught fire, but it was soon extinguished by a local farmer shoveling snow onto it. A beet field bomber, if you will. Seagoing trials were completed by October 1974. Interestingly, it was during this period that radars on Turkey recorded Yak-36Ms at a shade over Mach 1, which must have either been a dive or a radar error. Pilot conversion courses were run in the Crimea, with control of the aircraft described as being extremely difficult. This spurred development of a two-seat trainer version. The nose of the Yak-36U was extended to accommodate the second cockpit, increasing length to 58.25 feet. The front cockpit was quite far below the rear to give improved visibility from the back. It was initially intended to be armed and combat capable, but it was never deployed in this role. NATO called this version the Forger B. The single-seat Forger A's first deployment was on Kiev on the 15th of December 1975. It was revealed to NATO when the carrier transited the Bosphorus in July 1976. The Montreux Convention required the Soviets to disclose the 43,000-ton cruiser's aircraft complement, and thus the Forger was revealed to the world. Forgers were deployed in squadrons of 12, although the limited capacity of the Kiev's hangar deck meant that 8 was more typical for a deployment. The hangar had space for a maximum of 22 aircraft. NATO observed them in action while Kiev was en route to Murmansk via the North Atlantic. They were impressed by the stability the aircraft demonstrated during takeoff and landing, but apparently already realized that the Forger's performance was quite limited. It was during this cruise that the Yak-36M was redesignated Yak-38 by the Central Committee. Tactically, the Yak-38's main utility was its ability to extend the range of the air defense umbrella against patrol aircraft out to about 100 nautical miles. Kiev's own M11 Storm SAM system had a range of only 19 miles, so the additional bubble was somewhat useful, but the limited all-aspect capabilities of the ATOL and the AFID meant that the Forger was next to useless against an incoming strike aircraft like a Buccaneer or an Intruder. It lacked the performance margin to chase one down, nor did it have the fuel to set up an advantageous angle. The comparison to the Sea Harrier is quite stark. The British aircraft could carry more than twice the weapons, twice the distance, and its Sea Eagle missiles had nearly 5 times the range and much greater lethality than Grom. In a dogfight, the Sea Harrier had better thrust to mass, lower wing loading, it could vector thrust to gain an advantage, and it had the all-aspect AIM-9L Sidewinder. Otherwise, they were equally matched aircraft. As you might expect, the Forger's early years were quite challenging. It was a complicated weapons system introduced in an unforgiving environment and into the hands of a service with no prior fixed-wing aviation experience. Having 2 different types of engine in a single airframe would have been bad enough, but vertical takeoff and landing added harsh vibration and impact to the mix, compounded by the effects of saltwater corrosion. Mean time between severe equipment failure during the 1970s was 1 failure per 22 hours of operation, which improved to once per 60 hours by 1988. Not exactly exemplary. Another issue that the Navy encountered early on was the Forger's sensitivity to air temperature and humidity. When Kiev sailed down into the South Atlantic to operate off the African coast, the 30-degree temperatures meant that Forgers could barely take off. Even when operating at reduced loads, engine starting proved difficult. Reducing load meant carrying less internal fuel, reducing combat radius to less than 75 miles. This problem was still not resolved when the Minsk deployed off Vietnam in September 1979, as a Forger was lost while attempting a rolling takeoff because it couldn't gain enough speed to lift off. The small contingent of Navy Forgers sent for combat trials in Afghanistan encountered related issues when operating from high-altitude bases. Forgers had to begin their missions before 5 in the morning or the air would be too hot and thin for a safe landing after their mission. As more pilots were trained and gained experience with the type, the use of rolling takeoffs and run-on landings served to increase the Forger's usefulness. Useful radius of action increased to 180 miles when carrying 3,000 pounds of stores. The Navy also experimented with deploying Forgers to supply ships and amphibious assault vessels in the same way the Royal Navy would. Despite the limitations, the Navy was sufficiently happy with the Yak-38 that Yakovlev were instructed to prepare an improved variant in August 1981. The objective was to improve takeoff performance and add another 2,000 pounds of stores carriage. Changes therefore focused on uprated engines, in this case the R28 main engine and 2 new RD38 lift motors. These offered £7,170 of thrust each versus 6,300 or so in the RD-36. When it eventually emerged in early 1982, the Yak-38M had a maximum vertical takeoff weight of just under £25,000, and it could lift 26,500 when rolling. By December 1982, this improved variant was rolling off the production lines in Saratov. It still lacked the radar and beyond visual range missile capabilities that the Navy had wanted in 1967, but its greater range and the detailed changes made to some aspects to improve deck handling meant that it did represent an upgrade. 50 Yak-38Ms were built through to 1988, joining 143 Yak-38s and 38 trainers. They were retired almost as soon as the Cold War ended, with the last examples out of service in 1993. Some of the last Yak-38Ms had less than a dozen hours on them, but were stored or scrapped nonetheless. Just before the type retired, a single Yak-38M performed at Farnborough. The Forger is an interesting subject. It seemingly served no tactical purpose beyond moral support for Soviet Navy battle groups operating outside their bastions. The fact that it was produced at all is due to Yakovlev's enduring influence over the Soviet military-industrial complex and the constant flip-flopping on naval strategy that occurred throughout the Soviet era. Although the rational strategy was bastion defense, more expansive admirals and ministers regularly commissioned studies for blue water fleets that could challenge the US and NATO. The Forger was procured during one of these periods. Once they were operating something, the Soviets tended to carry on doing so, as stopping doing so doubtless meant offending someone. Was it useful? Well, probably not in a shooting war with NATO, although it might have had some small utility in the Baltic or Arctic Ocean in searching for NATO patrol aircraft. Outside of that, if the Soviets had ever intervened in a conflict involving a coastal nation and decided to execute an amphibious landing, then the Forger might have been somewhat helpful, although limited magazine depth and loiter time would have made it a bit marginal, and of course it could only operate in cold places. Added to this was a relatively poor safety record. During the type's 15-year service life, 36 of the Yak-38 series were lost in accidents. That's about 15.6% of the overall total. In 31 cases, though, the pilots ejected, including 18 automatic ejections and 13 pilot-initiated ones. All ejections were successful, which is a pretty remarkable tribute to the automatic escape system. There's not much more to say about the Forger than that. It was a steampunk engineering marvel, but not a particularly useful combat aircraft. Yakovlev was not done yet, though. His next jump jet was probably one of the most intriguing what-ifs in military aviation history.